Okay, this is now the last presentation of the day, last but not least. So the presenter is Zakaria Djebbara, and he's one of the two winners for the first place of this award. Dr. Djebbara, who just recently finished his Ph.D., won the second Live M32 system with this paper entitled Sensorimotor Brain Dynamics Reflect Architectural Affordances, which was published in PNAS. The jury members rated this paper particularly high in the dimensionality of the data collected, as well as the quality of the data analysis. The judges especially enjoyed the theoretical background surrounding the embodied cognition. So we look forward to this last talk. And if Zach is ready, then he gets the presenter rights. Okay, Zach?
Yes, just a second. Right, so which screen do you see?
We see your PowerPoint screen, not yet in the presentations mode. We see the MATLAB.
Does this work?
Yeah, that is good.
Yeah, all right then. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you to Brain Products for setting the whole thing up here, and also thank you very much for the award, and of course also congratulations to James and Andrew for some super awesome studies that we also learned a bit about here today. I think they are super cool, and of course this award is certainly a career highlight for me. It's definitely a milestone that keeps me motivated to pursue this emerging intersection between architecture and cognition. So thank you a lot. So as introduced, my name is Zach, and I'm an architect with a particular interest in cognitive neuroscience and psychology and philosophy, besides architecture, of course. So I just recently defended my PhD, which was entitled, as you can see here, expecting space and inactive and active inference approach to transitions. So the experiment that I will present today was the key paper in my monograph, and of course if you want to read the whole PhD, do not hesitate to mail me. I will send it to you. However, today I will just present some of the underlying thoughts with regard to the experiment that we conducted in Gramann's lab in Berlin, Mobile Brain Body Imaging Lab. So yeah, I will touch upon architecture and cognition from each of their respective perspectives. Right, so a quick outline here. I will just briefly talk about affordances and how they relate to architecture, and further on to action perception cycle. Then I will walk you through the MoBI experiment that we conducted, and then I will go through some results and finally conclude on the study. Right, so the phenomenology in architecture is usually understood as the soft and qualitative part of architecture, and you will have some researchers focusing on the multisensory experiences. For example, looking at a soft material and then feeling it in the hands without really touching it. And you also have others focusing on the sensing of atmospheres in spaces. So there's basically many different directions when it comes to the experience of space. But one thing that characterizes all directions here is that the world itself is a primacy, and for architects, we like to think that it is a designed world, right? So we're always situated in a designed world, right? So some of you might recognize this picture here. It's the monolith from the movie A Space Odyssey, and believe it or not, but this has caused some heated debate among architects, because the monolith sort of reflects the first piece of architecture on Earth. And the trouble is whether the first piece of architecture really should be thought of as an abstract formalism dump, because the sharpness of the form in art can be an architectural ideal for some architects at least. But would we not expect the first piece of architecture to be related to our bodies and our biological needs? I mean, of course, this is a movie, and debate is actually addressing something else. It's actually addressing the genesis of architecture and the primal needs that architecture must meet. right? So here, Phenomenology of Architecture insists that architecture is firstly perceived and sensed relative to our bodies. And to give an example, beyond human beings, you can think of a bird's nest, and think of how the bird's nest is kind of bird body friendly architecture. So sometimes architects actually do pay attention to this sensorimotor coupling. And this picture here is from the Nora house by Atelier Bauau. And it shows quite well how affordances sort of emerge from the sensorimotor coupling. We can easily imagine how to explore the space and use the space in different ways. But designing spaces is not an easy task, especially if you scale it up. So this is from Zahavi Studio, showing how architects basically design what the users can perceive and how they can interact in a more complex building. Now, ideally, we would like our architects to know something about sensorimotor coupling. This is especially if we believe that our experience of architecture is reflected in those dynamics. I personally like to think of the architects as partially the designer of human and bodily dynamics, because of the very fundamental processes in the body. They refer to maintaining a homeostatic balance, which is the balance between the body and the current environment. So architects, they sort of set the stage or draw the possibilities in our environment, and this is precisely how architecture can enter the field of biology. Because if we kind of take a step back to the homeostatic balance, we will find that in the realm of biology and empirical science, the way we perceive the world is a matter of how it affects our homeostatic balance. So for any living organism, it must interact with its environment and make adaptive, or it has to make adjustments that fits its body and its acceptable bounds. And this is what ties perception to the body. So homeostasis means also that you have to maintain a number of biological parameters relative to the chaotic environment. And there are conceptually two environments that the organism has to change. There is the internal environment, which can be changed by internal chemical regulations, and there's the external one, which is basically by acting in the environment. So, for example, if you're thirsty, you will act so you can bring the source of water in your immediate environment. And basically, this is a synchronization of two functions. And essentially, what I'm describing here is a dynamic system. So we learn from the way that we change and the transition in time rather than from the state. So we learn more from how to bring water into our environment rather than knowing that we are thirsty. Right. So one of the first to actually apply this idea to cognition was Ross Ashby in cybernetics, and this essentially paved the way for a renewed understanding of living organisms. So that interaction with the environment is how equilibration and behavior emerges. And here I'm mentioning this in relation to a macro scale. So when we move further down into a micro scale, you see the movement of emergence. And this idea covers that behavior emerges from an integrative and collective effort on a cellular level. So for example, the emergence of perception is inherently related to an organism's body and perceptual organs, which in turn are always situated in an environment. So there is knowledge in our way of being. For example, during fight or flight, an opening in the environment is not perceived without a value. It's perceived as a potential escape because we are integrated with the environment. And of course, this depends on the body. For example, is the opening big enough to fit through? Right. And this brings me to the 4E cognition framework that has lately gaining a lot of attention, because the 4E cognition framework is a dynamic systems approach to cognition, and the approach nicely illustrates how the environment is present in all 4 E's. So one of the first E's is the embeddedness. So we are always embedded in an environment. The next one is to be enacted. So we have enacted sensations. But these sensations are always situated in an environment and enacted in an environment. There is the embodied perspective, and we're always embodied relative to the environment, and finally extended in the environment. So just like the initial idea of emergence, even when we scale it all up from cellular activity to complex human behavior, the dependency on environment is still present. And in short, you can see that 4E cognition framework basically states that cognition emerges from the interaction between a brain, a body, and an environment. And it is from from this framework that we attempted to state a hypothesis, which reads that it is expected to find differences in cortical responses to covary as a function of affordances over sensory and motor areas. So coming to the experiment here, basically the whole MoBI, mobile brain body imaging approach provided us with all the necessary advantage to actually take this hypothesis to the testing ground. So it is the integration of mobile EEG with virtual reality and freely moving participants that gives us the flexibility to do a more ecological setup. Right, so the experiment basically was me asking my participants to transit from one space to another through varying sizes of openings, where I would be varying the affordances of the door, so that would be the width. The paradigm of the experiment was a basic S1, S2 paradigm, or better known as the go-no-go paradigm. And it was designed to focus on the time domain of the brain activity, since we wanted to sort of know how immediate action is present in perception, and also, of course, to which degree. So my participants would start with a black sphere around their head for approximately 3 seconds, which is in the top left corner of this diagram. Then the sphere pops, and they can see the space that they're situated in. And before them, right in front of them, there is a gray opening of a specific size. And they were instructed to wait for the gray door to either turn green or red for go or no-go respectively. If it turned green, they were allowed to pass, and they were instructed to touch the red circle and return to their start position. And then they would score the emotional dimension in virtual reality. And finally, they would have to restart the task. And here's one of the downsides of doing experimental research. They had to do this particular trial 240 times to get a stable signal, ERP signal. Right, so the experiment is tailored so that there are 3 different openings, but only one of them completely robs you the potential to pass. It can be difficult to understand this trial, so I will just walk you through a video of a single participant and how they experienced the transition. But before I get there, I want you to notice that on the left-hand side here, on the narrow condition, you only have an opening of 20 centimeters, which is absolutely impossible for you to pass. In the mid-size, you have a 1 meter sized opening, which is passable. It might seem difficult, but it's definitely passable. And you have the wide door on the far right, which is the door that is easily passable. I'll have you know that a regular door is 90 centimeters, so the mid-sized door is actually a bit bigger than that one. Right, so for the video here, so basically this is what they see: pitch black darkness. They don't see anything, and basically at some point the sphere pops, and they will be able to see the environment. So this is the gray door, and as you can see, this one turned green, which is basically the cue for you're allowed to sort of pass. So as you can see, they pass, the door slides open, there's a red circle, they touch it in virtual reality, and they return to their start position. And here they answer the emotional questionnaire using a laser from the controller in virtual reality, and then they pull the trigger, and basically they're back in the black sphere, ready for the next trial, as you see here. And before them, it can either be the same opening size again as before, or it can be a new one. And here you'll see what it looks like to have a wide door in front of you. This is the one, 1.5 meters, easily passable. Then it narrows a bit down, this is mid, 1 meter wide, also passable. And there you go, this is the narrow one of only 0.2, so 20 centimeters, impossible to pass. Now I will just show you what how we look into the ERPs. So I will just run some EEGs activity while showing you what they perceive. So this is for the white condition. And there you go, it pops open and we see a very nice evoked response there. And for the mid-sized door, and you will notice that they do not differ that much from one another. And now for the narrow condition, you'll see that in the occipital area, so in the back of the head, you see that there has been a noticeable difference in the ERPs. So of course I ran through the statistics here and I showed that there are significant differences for the narrow condition always in both the FCZ and the OZ. So basically over parts of the motor area and the visual area here. Right, and then also for the S2, so basically the signal of go or no go, I also show that there are significant differences. Of course, yeah, you're welcome to read the whole paper right there. So when we looked into some of the behavior results, we found that there were no significant differences in the no-go, which I take as a good sign. So basically all were agreed that not going is not that interesting. So, but second, we found that there has been an increase in balance as the door gets wider, and we also see a clear decrease in dominance. Surely we expected a decrease in dominance. And also we see that arousal showed that most were less aroused in the narrow condition, which of course is also something that we expected. But interestingly also, people were generally slower at approaching the narrow door. Right, so we take these behavioral measures to be just revealing parts of how affordances relates to the human being. It could, I mean, this would correspond to asking the questionnaires, the participants, how did they transit and by what means did they transit and under what circumstances did they transit, and all these questions that can help us define the type of action as affordances basically covers. So here I just picked out the two channels, FCZ and OZ, to illustrate the ERPs, and this is for the S1 Q. So basically, this is the moment that the sphere pops and they're able to see the environment. And we found significant differences as early as 200 milliseconds for the narrow condition as compared to the other conditions. And again, also in the occipital cortex, we found that the narrow condition was processed significantly different. So it seems that affordances or the motor-related response is reflected in the early evoked responses, just like we hypothesized, or rather I should say that we were not able to falsify the hypothesis. So during the go-no-go queue, so when it turns either green or red, we also located a potential or component, an early post-imperative complex, behaving again so that there were only significant differences for the narrow condition. And this was also again further, as you can see here, supported by the post-imperative negative variation, the PINF component for the narrow condition. Right. So this all I mean these results, they all support the idea that the evoked response depends on the affordances. So to conclude on the study, since the results they showed that the narrow condition was processed significantly different from better affordances already at the time that the black sphere popped, and we also found that the moment that they were told to go, knowing that they cannot pass, is processed significantly different. So we concluded that the sensory and motor predictions must be related. So the whole question of how can I act is processed in parallel to what do I perceive, and this is quite remarkable, particularly from a philosophical and especially architectural point of view. And since affordances are in themselves intuitive predictions of potential interaction with the environment, we believe that this involvement rests on this predictive behavior. And of course, as a note for architects, I believe it is worth noting that human beings may be generally predictive in nature already upon perceiving the environment. So this piece of information could be useful when designing openings, corners, elevated transitions, and so on. All of these interactive elements in architecture. So basically, the take-home message here is that architecture is coupled to our sensory and motor dynamics. So what's next? Basically, there's a lot that needs to be done, at least for me. I want to still look into the time frequency analysis and some packed phase amplitude coupling to better understand the involvement of top-down and bottom-up processes. And also regarding new projects, we aim to bringing the experiments out to the real world, for example, museums, schools, libraries, and so on. And also we're looking into constructing a dynamic causal model with UCL to generate new hypotheses of how affordances may be reflected in sensorimotor dynamics. Right, so I would just want to say thank you to all the people that were part of this project. I guess that was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach.
Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, we do have one, Piero, for Zach.
Okay.
They asked me to read it out again. If you time lock to the onset of the cue and what the subject, if you time lock to the onset of the cue and what the subjects perceive is different for each door size, how can you be sure that the ERP differences you see actually reflect the condition and not the low-level differences, e.g. contrast luminance of large versus small openings?
Yeah, so is the question ready, done, or?
Yeah.
Can I still share my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, let me just put you back as presenter, 1 second. You should be able to share your screen again, Zach.
Do you see it? The presentation?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so this question I've been asked a couple of times, so I kind of prepared something. So basically, it's not difficult to see that it's not only as a time series evolution that this phenomenon of affordances being reflected in sensorimotor dynamics occurs. It's also something that we can easily perceive in the frequency domain, which I find much harder to relate to well, basically early visual processes such as illuminance and so on. This is one argument against that. And also, there are, to my knowledge at least, there are no papers that can show differences in early visual processes where you use at least the same amount of horizontal lines and vertical lines in all experiments, which we did obviously in all doors. So for me at least, I'm still of course critical to my results. I don't find them alpha omega and true and so on. This is why I still want to keep doing experiments with affordances, but I do think that this is pretty solid. I don't know if that answered the question.
Let me have a look for you. Cool, thanks. So I would say that's a yes.
Awesome.
Anybody have any other questions?
Okay, then maybe Scott.
Scott, let me unmute you.
Yeah.
Okay, Scott.
Yeah, so that's a very nice thought. I like it very much. And what do you have you thought of doing upper body affordances? You know, cups with handles and or frameworks in which you could reach something versus where it's more difficult or you can't do it. It would be either virtual or real, or virtual or actual, I should say. You know, there's a whole world of kind of exploration of not only at the architectural scale. In fact, it's very interesting to think that this affordances the world of what can we say, imaginative or pre-planned or predicted affordance for movement occurs both obviously at the local scale, for instance, stepping over the obstacles or holding the cup handle and so on, but also in terms even of huge spaces. I think it's a beautiful idea, and that should be very interesting to follow up.
Thank you for your nice words, and it's definitely something that I'm looking to follow up on. I mean, to me, this is just the beginning of a huge domain. I hope so. Of course, I'm trying to pursue a lot of architects to start reading some more philosophy and cognitive neuroscience. It's not an easy task. Neither is it the other way around. But luckily, it's a bit easier because, well, everyone has a taste in architecture. That's for sure. But yeah,
well,
as I said,
I once read an account of, not the scientific paper, unfortunately, but this account of an experiment where they had people do different tasks in low ceiling rooms and high ceiling rooms. And they found that the detailed tasks like accounting, adding numbers and so on were done more accurately in the low ceiling room. But anything creative was done much better in the high ceiling room.
Yeah, well, this is like one of the parameters that I would love to look into. I know that there are also a lot of studies showing that if you have low-hanging lights in classrooms, children appear to just don't talk so loud. And these are like some of the effects that you would like to investigate as a researcher in architecture. So yeah, I mean, as I said, this is a whole new field, and I see a lot of potential. I see a lot of development. It can go so many different directions. So yeah, I'm trying to keep people like Klaus close to me, so he can always sort of guide me, yeah, and stuff like that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Zach. Very nice talk.